To get started. I apologize, had to get set up and had some connection issues, but we are ready to go now. So I'll give you opportunity to come on in and to make sure that people know that we are indeed live and we're ready to begin Sunday school. Again, let me apologize for the tardiness. We had to work through some connection issues, and if for some reason that we do fall off because of connection issues, just know that I'm going to jump right back on. All right, but we are indeed live and we are ready to roll. Let's have a word of prayer and then we'll begin our conversation around emotional health on the day. Father, we thank you for the day. Thank you for this opportunity for us to come together as brothers and sisters once again to gather around this conversation of emotional health. I pray that you would pour into me. I pray that you would be seen, heard, and felt in everything that goes out in this moment. Again, we thank you for this opportunity. We thank you for this privilege of communion, of coming together, brothers and sisters, this privilege of community. We're so grateful for it. It's in Jesus' name that I pray with thanksgiving. Amen. All right. Let's go ahead and let's get started. Again, those of you who may just be coming in, I apologize that we are jumping on a little late, but we are here. We're able to work through all of our issues, and we are ready to go. Vet, I see you. Good morning to you. Thank you for being on. Miss Rayanne and family, good morning to you. Thank you for being on. Leslie, good morning to you. Thank you for being on, and Brother Donald Brown, good morning to you, sir. And Jared is on. Good morning, man. Good to have you on, my brother. And Dana is on. So good to have all of you on. You all know over the last few weeks we've been talking about emotional health, and I want to continue that conversation on today. But today I want to focus in on family. How issues of the family can impact our emotional health. And this is such a heavy subject that it's going to take me 2 weeks to get through. So bear with me on today as I share with you some of the content that I have for you. Also remember that I'm working through a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And one of the bottom lines is that if we are going to be healthy, we have to understand that we are integrated beings. And if we ignore any part of who we are, it's going to impact our overall health. So we're spiritual, we're emotional, we're mental, physical, all of these areas. And we've got to make sure that we're paying attention to each one if we are to be healthy. And so we just happen to be focusing in on emotional health, especially during a time like this when there's so much going on as we navigate this virus, as we navigate death. There's so much that we're trying to navigate in this season that I believe God has us talking about our emotional health. All right. And so today's focus is on family and how family can have an impact on who we are emotionally. All right. And so we are getting ready to dig deep into this. Let me just start off here. Let me go here because I want us to understand two essential truths as we move forward today. Peter Scazzaro gives us two truths, and these are truths that we can actually find from a biblical perspective, not just what we experience. Truth number one: the blessings and sins of our families, going back 2 and 3 generations, profoundly impact who we are today. Get it? The blessings and the sins of our families impact who we are. Number 2, discipleship requires putting off the sinful patterns of our family of origin and relearning how to do life God's way in God's family. So I want to say this from the outset, that our families have an undeniable impact on who we are and who we are becoming. That's the positive and the negative. So understand that our families impact us positively and negatively. You already know this, but it's important that we understand that as a foundation for today's conversation, how important our understanding of family is. Now, we're going to look at this from a biblical perspective. We're going to look at some biblical families, and we're going to see how this thing works out. But I want you to think about your own family, and I want you to think about some of the challenges that you have with your family, how some of their positive traits have rubbed off on you, but also how some of their negative traits have rubbed off on you. But notice what he says, that families, this idea of going back 2 and 3 generations, so that there are some members of your family that you have never met. They were dead before you got here, yet and still they have an impact on who you are. Why? Because they impacted your parents. And when we talk about family, I'm not just talking about, immediates or even from a biblical perspective. We're not just talking about, mom and dad and grandma and granddad. We're also talking about aunts and uncles with cousins. We're talking about the whole clan and how your family can impact who you are. So let's go further. Peter says it's common to observe certain patterns from one generation to the next. Patterns like divorce, alcoholism, addictive behavior, sexual abuse, poor marriages, one child running off, mistrust of authority, pregnancy out of wedlock, and an inability to sustain relationships. Now, the list can go on, but many times when you look at families, you can identify patterns. I know families that you can trace back 3 generations, and the mothers had children at 17 years old. I know families that are like that. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm not saying anything is bad about those families. I'm just pointing out that from a generational perspective, you can see that. That also, when you look at some families, you can see the connections in how those families view marriage or how marriage plays out in those families. Not every marriage in those families ends in divorce. There are times in which those marriages have a bunch of secrets, and those secrets contain abuse physically and sexually. You can see this in families, and there's so many families that are impacted by this, and you can just look at them and you can see the generational patterns. And I want you to see that. And I even want you to do this. I don't want you to get into the comment section on this. I just want you to think about this in your own family. Can you identify some of the generational tendencies in your family? Can you identify some of them? And when I say the generational tendencies, I'm not even just talking about the bad stuff. There might be some good stuff that you can identify. Granddad, dad, and me. Can you identify some of those patterns that stretch out over generations in your family? I want you to take a minute and think about it. I know that I can think of quite a few. From the negative side, alcoholism is definitely something that is embedded within my family, and it's something that we've had to navigate, right? So I can point that out in my family. On a positive side, the value of some for education, right? So I can see a pattern brewing in my sister, right? So actually both of them, but I'm gonna highlight Carla. Carla has a passion for education. Her husband, Samaj, has a passion for education. You can connect that in Samaj's family. So his mother to Samaj and Carla, and now their kids, SJ as well as Seth, have a love of learning. That is a positive trait that I can trace throughout their lineage, from the child to the parents to the grandparents. All right, so I want you to think about that, because that's what we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be unpacking this in today's conversation, because whether you know it or not, your family is impacting your emotional health. Whether you pay attention to it or not, people who have your last name, people who you share blood with, the people whose womb you came from, they are impacting who you are. And if you don't pay attention to it, you won't be able to really get to the point where you have some say in the who you are right now, and also the who you are becoming. Because the truth of the matter is we need to shatter some stuff. And I hear people talk about all the time, Pastor Cook, I need you to pray that we would break some generational curses in my family. And I need you to know that it's not just a matter of prayer if you're going to break some I would say some commonalities in your history. It's not just a matter of prayer, but it's also a matter of intention. Are you intentional? Are you intentional about what's going on and how family is impacting you? All right, so want to be clear about this, and want you to know exactly where we are going. Let me just stop for a second, because my cousin is on. He says, good morning, Dwight, and he says, my grandmother is watching. So you all show my grandma some love all the way in Cleveland, Ohio. So good to have you on. So let's dive deeper. I want to come back here. He says, it is common to observe certain patterns from one generation to the next. And you can read that list for yourself. Let's dig deeper here. Because as we look at family ties and how issues in family, both positive and negative, can impact who you are, a question comes into place. Is it a result of nature or nurture? So, when you deal, for instance, if you have a history in your family of family members abusing alcohol, for instance, is that a result of something in the DNA of your family? Is that a result of your nature, or is that a result of the environment that you grew up in? Right? So is it something that is just inbred in you? It is innate to you? Or is it a result of what you see? Is it a matter of environment? Is it nature, or is it nurture? The truth of the matter is, if you talk to one psychologist or one sociologist, they will tell you different things. So the truth is, we don't know if it's a matter of nature or nurture. It's probably a mixture of the two. But you need to pay attention to, again, who is in your family, but you also need to pay attention to some of the attitudes, some of the habits, some of the tendencies that you grew up around, because those impact who you are becoming, and who you will ultimately be. All right? So this idea, is it a question of nature or nurture, is a very important question. We don't have a definitive answer for, but we need to pay attention to both sides of the coin, because from my perspective, it's a part of who you are innately, but it's also connected to who you were around when you grew up. All of it is impacted, and your environment is important when it comes to this conversation. All right, so let's dig deeper. Family ties. Family patterns from the past are played out in our present relationships without us necessarily being aware of it. Let me read that first line again. Family patterns from the past are played out in our present relationships without us necessarily being aware of it. So church, I need you to understand that whether you're aware of it or not, there are some things you just do because daddy did it or because mama did it. And they did it because their dad did it or their mom did it or they got it from their uncle. That there's some stuff that's just passed on in the midst of the family. There's some stuff that I do because I'm a Cook on one side and I'm a Norton on the other side. It is just a part of what I've seen. It's a part of who I am. And sometimes I do it whether I know it or not. Very, very important. It says someone may look like they may look like an individual acting alone, but they are really players in a larger family system that may go back, as the Bible says, 3 to 4 generations. Unfortunately, it is not possible to erase the negative effects of our history. This family history lives inside all of us, especially in those who attempt to bury it. The price we pay for this flight is high. Only the truth will set us free. So the reason why we want to deal with some hard subjects in this series, like how family impacts who we are, because if we never face the thing, we'll never be able to change the thing. If we're never honest about how our families impacted us, we will never be able to walk in the trueness of who we are right now. That before I could, I'll say this, that before my doctor ever or before he ever prescribes me any medicine, he diagnoses what I have. The diagnosis comes into play so that we know what it is that I have. And once I know what I have, I get the proper treatment so that I can get better. Our problem oftentimes is we want to get right to treatment without diagnosis. Here's the problem with that. I remember one time I didn't feel like waiting on my doctor. I was calling and I couldn't get in until next week, the following week. So I went to an urgent care and everything was cool. They gave me some medicine. I thought everything was great. Well, I ended up feeling worse. I ended up going to my doctor that next week, and my doctor told me at the urgent care, they gave you a wrong diagnosis and they were treating you for a problem you didn't have. And now there's complications, not just what you actually got. There's complications because the medicine they gave you was the wrong thing for you to take. I point that out because the problem is not just for some of us that we don't try to diagnose what's wrong with us. For some of us, it's a misdiagnosis. We have a wrong outlook on what the issue is. And because we have a wrong outlook on the issue, we go the wrong way of trying to solve it. And once you do that, you put yourself in even greater risk and you compound the problem. Right? So this is important. This whole conversation around family and how family impacts us. I want you to understand how important this is. Now, here's the truth that I need you to understand. You can't change your family. I know for me, I don't want to change my family. I love my family. But even though I don't want to change my family, I love my family. I still have to be honest about ways in which my family has impacted who I am on the positive side as well as on the negative side. All right. So I want to talk about from a biblical perspective. Let's just look at, I encourage you to read the book of Genesis. And in the book of Genesis, we get the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is a biblical family. And when we look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see on one level, blessings were given to Abraham because of his obedience. So he got blessings, and those blessings flowed from generation to generation. But at the same time, we see a pattern of sin and brokenness that was transmitted through this family, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. So there's blessing on one side we see in this family, but then there's the transmission of brokenness and sin. So let me just unpack some of this, because I think this example is a good example in Scripture to see how family can impact you from a generational perspective. So the first thing I want to take a look at is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was a pattern of lying in each generation. So Abraham lied twice about Sarah. Then Isaac and Rebekah's marriage was characterized by lies. Jacob lied to almost everyone. His name, in fact, meant deceiver. 10 of Jacob's children lied about Joseph's death, faking a funeral, and keeping a quote-unquote family secret for more than 10 years. And I should ask you all to get in. As a matter of fact, go ahead and get in the comment section. Tell me this. Do you know family secrets that are unique to your family? Just say yes or no. I know for me that I do know of some family secrets, that these are secrets that are unique to our family. Do you know of some in your family? And I just want you to say yes or no. Please don't tell us any of your family secrets. Now, biblical characters, we get all of their family secrets, right? So we get Abraham's lying. We get all of that. We get what went on, with, Jacob and all of them. So we see such and such was sleeping with such and such had a baby with this one, and this one got drunk, and this one slept with this one, and this one raped this one. And then because that person got raped, the brothers went to town and they killed everybody. It was a whole bunch of those type of secrets in this family. I see Selena, she says, Lord have mercy, yes. Vet says yes. Leslie says no. So some of us know, yes, we know some, others know we don't. But all families have something that went on, something that went on in the background. And many times we think that those secrets are underneath the surface. But even if we don't know the truth of those secrets end up impacting who we ultimately become. And I'll just paint a picture just real quick before I just unpack some more of this. I know of people who they came up not knowing the tension that was connected to their birth. So they came up just thinking that their father was their father. But the secret that existed in the family was that mom and dad weren't together at the time in which they were conceived. Mom and dad decided to stay together, but they weren't together at that moment. And so this child's father or mother is different than the other kids. Well, what ends up happening is the spouse that was cheated on has a bit of resentment, even though they decide to stay around. And it impacts how they raise the child, how they talk to the child, what they do for the child, sometimes what they do for the child in connection to the other children. Now, I bring that up because it's a secret, and that secret is not known to the child, but that secret impacts how the child is raised. And I can tell you story after story after story in communities like that, where some secret impacts the individual. My brothers and my sisters, I want to pull this out because I want you to know. I want you to be clear on the fact that family stuff impacts us at a level, whether we are conscious, we know about it, or whether we don't know about it. All right. So let's dig deeper in this conversation, because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it wasn't just a pattern of lying that went from generation to generation, but then there was a pattern of favoritism. Abraham favored Ishmael, Isaac favored Esau, Jacob favored Joseph, and later Benjamin. And so this favoritism is something that was passed on, but it also created a competitive environment among the children. So why did Joseph's brothers hate him? Because of the parenting environment that was created by their father. Jacob created this environment of competition because Joseph was favored. They didn't like Joseph. They end up plotting to kill Joseph. But that favoritism, though it impacted Joseph on his level because of his daddy, Jacob didn't just pull that out of the sky. Jacob got it from his daddy, and his daddy got it from his daddy. It was a pattern that appeared generationally and wreaked havoc in this family. Generations. Let's move on. What about brothers experiencing a cutoff from one another in each generation, so that sibling rivalry turns into separation? Isaac and Ishmael, these are Abraham's sons, were cut off from one another. Jacob fled his brother Esau and was completely cut off from Esau for years. Joseph was cut off from his 10 brothers for more than a decade. So you see this pattern going back to Isaac and Ishmael, went back all the way there, and it ultimately impacts Joseph, in which brothers were separated. How many times in our families do we have siblings that just don't get along and just cut each other off? And if we go into the generations, we'll find that there was some issues between our parents and their siblings, or even go up higher, it was some issues there. Sometimes this stuff is generational, and we take on these habits and we take on these behaviors. So, favoritism. Miss Denise McConnell, so good to have you on. Thank you for watching. What about poor intimacy in the marriages of each generation? This is another thing that plagued Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, please understand the context is different between Abraham's day to our day. So I do realize that we are dealing with some cultural differences, but at the same time, it is still important for us to point this out, because even though certain cultures, you could have wives and you could have some concubines, you can have all of that, we still see in the midst of that the same type of turmoil that crosses all cultures, right? So Abraham had a child with Hagar, and that caused some issues in his marriage. Isaac had a terrible relationship with Rebecca, right? And then Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and those wreaked some havoc in areas of his marriage and the intimacy of it. And I know that sex is not one of those things that we often talk about, but sexuality and the tendencies of it many times is passed along generationally and we don't even realize it. Intimacy, issues with that is passed on from a generational perspective. We don't even pay attention. I know we're dealing with some hard stuff on this Sunday morning, but it's important that we understand how this emotional baggage impacts who we are. I want to go through just a couple of things. Peter Scazzaro in his book, he calls them the 10 Commandments, right? So what he's alluding to is that sometimes in families, you have these unspoken rules about how you see things. And these unspoken rules about how you see things, you pass along because it was passed on to you. And so he calls them his 10 Commandments, and I'm just gonna read through these categories. I won't put them on the screen, but I'll just read through them. And all of these won't impact you, but I want you to think about some of the ideas that you have about some of these categories. Number one, money. So he says that for him and people that were connected to him, the unseen and the unspoken message about money from family was, money is the best source of security. The more money you have, the more important you are. Make lots of money to prove you made it. So those are unspoken messages that he got in his family, or maybe some get in their family when it comes to money. So money is the best source of security. The more money you have, the more important you are. Make lots of money to prove you've made it. Anybody wanna comment and share with me, good or bad? It doesn't have to be bad, but just share with me some of your ideas about money. Maybe these were unspoken or even spoken in your family. Peter gives us 3. Money is the best source of security. The more money you have, the more important you are. Make lots of money to prove you made it. Anybody have anything that you want to share that was an idea that you picked up about money, good or bad? And as you do that, I'm going to move on to conflict. Conflict. He says this is what was dealt with for him and for others. For conflict, avoid conflict at all costs. Don't get people mad at you. Or loud, angry, constant fighting is normal. So when it came to conflict, what was passed on in this family was avoid conflict at all costs. Don't get people mad at you. Or 3, loud, angry, constant fighting is normal. I know some people today, they don't know how to be in a relationship, romantic, platonic, whatever it is, without their voices being on 10 all the time. They love hard and they fight harder. I know some folk like that. And when you connect with them and you have conversation with them, you get the sense that was the same way it was in their family. They always saw their parents arguing loud like that. And so conflict, that's how it's resolved. Loud, angry, hurling, sarcasm and all of that type of stuff. So let me see. Debbie says, what did Debbie say? We didn't have much money, but I never knew it because we had everything we needed. Debbie, that is a blessing, and I have that same testimony. I know my dad is just a picture of a hard worker, just like Steve is. But I know coming up now that we were poorer than I realized, but it was just a testimony to just how committed that my parents were, because my dad worked, but also my mom worked. My mom was a seamstress, and so she had her own business at one time, Alterations by Joanne. She also worked at the Tall Girl Shop where she did some alterations there. But Debbie, I have the same testimony. Darlene says one of the things that she learned about money coming up was money talks. Yes, indeed, Darlene, I did hear that one. Selena's on. Thank you, Selena. I'm certainly praying that this conversation is a blessing. All right. So number 3, here's one. What about sex? So these are some messages unspoken for Peter, but as well for others. So 1, sex is not to be spoken about openly. You don't talk about sex. Or 2, men can be promiscuous. Women must be chaste. So there's this messaging in which, men can sleep around as much as they want, and player, whatever lines that we use. Women do it, freak, hoe, whatever language that we use, we make it worse than, and that is something unspoken, right? And and it's even a bias that I have in my own head, because again, it's something that I was ingrained with. So I know I don't have any children, but I know in the back of my mind, I would have to work myself to make sure that I treated my children fairly here. So I know that I would have one thought about how I handled my daughter versus how I handled my son in this particular context. And I can say that because, of course, I know some brothers who battle that same tension. But it comes from this line, this whole idea that men can be promiscuous and women must be chaste. He says another one is that sexuality in marriage will come easily. It'll be normal. It'll be natural. Then you get married and realize it's not all you thought it would be. That like everything else in marriage, it requires communication and it requires work. That's true of everything in marriage. That's true of how you handle money. That's true with how you handle conflict. And it's also true with how you handle your sex life in marriage. But you can get the message that some way that sex will be the easy thing when it comes to marriage. So that's another area in which communication can be impacted by generational realities. Let's go to 4. What about grief and loss? Grief and loss, right? So how do families message with this? Well, Peter said some of the messaging he got in his family around grief and loss is that sadness is a sign of weakness, or that you are not allowed to be depressed, or get over losses quickly and move on. You know how many people want you to get over your tears because you crying makes them feel uncomfortable? So some ways, for some reason, they expect you to stop crying because they want to feel comfortable. I can't be around you. You always crying. And it's this message around this idea, you get over losses quickly, move on quickly. That's why, people say stupid things like when somebody loses a spouse, they've lost their husband or they lost their wife. These people have been married for 20 years. And the best thing you got is there's more fish in the sea. No, they don't always want to hear that, especially the week after they lost their spouse. You got to be careful with that. But those are messages that we get by being impacted by our family. Let me give you some more. What about number 5? Because Peter covers 10 of these categories. Number 5 is expressing anger. He says some of the messages he got communicated through family. Anger is dangerous and bad. Or explode in anger when you want to make a point. Or sarcasm is an acceptable way to release anger. You know, people always got a sarcastic thing to say. And I struggle with sarcastic folk. I do. But some people, that's how they process anger, and they process it that way because, again, that's how it was communicated in family. Let me just kind of move through these last ones. What about 6? When it comes to family, you owe your parents for all they've done for you. Don't speak of your family's dirty laundry in public. Duty to family and culture comes before everything. And again, I'm not necessarily saying these things are wrong. I'm just saying that these are things that he's sharing that he picked up on, messages that he picked up on from family about family. What about relationships? Is 7. Don't trust people. They will let you down. Or you put up this wall and says, nobody will ever hurt me like this again. So you just put up the wall because you don't want to feel hurt again. Or maybe you picked up this, don't show vulnerability. And, you know, I know brothers that definitely tell this to their sons. Don't ever let them see you down. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's something generationally that's passed on. What about attitudes towards different cultures? Only be close friends with people who look like you. Don't marry a person outside of your race or culture. Certain cultures or races are not as good as your own. Number 9, what does success look like? He says this is what he picked up throughout his time with family. He says success looks like getting into the best schools, making a bunch of money, or getting married and having children. And this pressure, and many of you know what it's like to feel pressure in your family. They want you to get married. They want you to get married and they want you to have kids. I know people ask me all the time, when you having some kids, what's going on? What you waiting on? Now, I don't get offended by it, but I do think about those people who have to deal with that, who for them not being able to have children is connected to something medical. And family is always putting pressure. And you feel that. 10, what about feeling and emotions? You're not allowed to have certain feelings. Your feelings are not important. Reacting with your feelings without thinking is okay. All right. So I just wanted to give you just some messages that people get from family about key issues of life. And you get those same messages or you get different ones, and it impacts your worldview, how you see the world. And it's important that we talk about that, because if you are going to be your best today and your best tomorrow, it's not just about some things that you've got to learn. Sometimes it's about some things you've got to unlearn. So that there are some ideas, there are some behaviors, there are some attitudes or some habits that you got from your mom, your dad, from your grandfather, your grandmother, your aunt, your uncle, great aunt, great uncle. There are some attitudes about life that are not conducive for where you are or where you are going. And those attitudes that they developed, they had to pick up for situations that you don't find yourself in. And so you've got to ask yourself, will that attitude work for me in the right now? Can I afford to live my life not trusting people? Can I afford to have the rest of my marriage be characterized by arguments that are always on 10? Can I continue to have relationships with my children that are characterized by favoritism, where it's obvious that I'm loving one child more than the other child? These are questions that we've got to ask ourselves, questions we've got to confront. Am I going to allow myself to continue to be defined by my family secrets? These are issues that if we don't deal with, these issues will continue to deal with us. And let me just say this about history as I begin to wrap this up. It's important that we understand that history matters. That's why those folk that say crazy stuff when it comes to conversations around race, for instance, and the issues of race in this country. You have people who will try to say, "Oh, well, that was centuries ago. That was hundreds of years ago. You got to forget that. You got to get over that." And they want to ignore the fact that those things that happened back then, they aren't just designed to be incubated in the back then, but there were some systems and some structures that were developed with those racist ideas, and many of those systems and those structures are still in place today. So that even though some of those things happened back then, the systems and the structures are still in place today, and it's hurting me today. So I can't just relegate it to a conversation that I got to get over it. No, I've got to deal with the systems and the structures that are in place. And once I deal with them, then we can get into a conversation around moving on. That's why when people say, when people have trouble with that phrase, Black Lives Matter, and then they come back with the phrase, all lives matter. It's not false that all lives matter. The problem is you want to use that phrase to overshadow the fact that Black lives have not mattered. And we know it evident by history, by the systems that are still in place. And this whole conversation around Black Lives Matter is not meant to diminish. So let's not change the subject or divert from what we're trying to talk about right now. It was actually one of my white pastors, a good friend of mine, and he has said this to me. He said, Daryl, he said, man, I struggle when I hear people combat that all lives matter, or when they respond to Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. He said, Daryl, all of my children matter. He said, but the child who is sick is the one that I've got to deal with right now. And he's one of those guys that just gets it. I loved that illustration. And my brothers and my sisters, this idea of history is so important because history impacts my present reality, but history also impacts my destiny. So if I don't deal with my history, my today is going to be messed up, and then my tomorrow is going to ultimately be messed up. So let me see this. What we got? Selena says, so many of these topics are not discussed within family structures, which causes unhealthy views of relationships, power, communication, the process of emotions, mental health issues, etc. Personally, what I viewed as the norm or healthy was actually toxic. That is such a good point, Selena, that we can get so comfortable with dysfunction that it becomes our normal. And when it becomes our normal, we just get so used to living there that, that's just where we pitch our tent. But you are so true. We have to see it for what it is. And if it's toxic, it's harming us. No matter how long we've been there, we've got a responsibility to correct the issue today. And understand as we move forward in this conversation, because I'm gonna have to pick this up with a part 2 on next week. But as we continue to go into this conversation, understand that this conversation will not be about how you go and change your family per se, because you can't force change on anybody else. This is going to help you to change the way you see yourself, so that while I may not be able to retroactively change what happened then, or even the people in my life, what I can do today is make sure that my family, my son, my daughter, does not have to live in that toxic mindset that I've gotten so accustomed to. And so it's about the change you can make today. And so let me just close here, because I got to end with some resolve. A week is too long for me not to end with just a little bit of resolve. This is why one of the most powerful teachings in the New Testament in our faith is the idea of adoption. The idea of adoption says that God says, I'm bringing you into my family. I am bringing you into a new family. And in this new family, you have new opportunities. You have a new way of seeing things. You have a new way of understanding. It is a different quality of life. And once you get into this new family, it will completely open the way you see things. Now, when you're adopted into God's family, that doesn't mean that you disown the family that you got and that you don't ever deal with them. No, you still deal with them. You still love on them. But now your way of seeing things and your way of perceiving things is different. The truth of the pain of your past will always be true. But here's the difference when you get into the new family, that pain is no longer in the driver's seat of your life. That those habits and those patterns, those ideas no longer dictate how you do life. That no longer do you have to say that because mom did it this way, I got to do it this way, or dad did it this way, I got to do it this way, or because people that have my last name did this, that I've got to do this. No, you get an opportunity to completely break the curse. You break the mold. You shatter the systems, and you shatter the structures. You shatter whatever chains were holding you and keeping you connected to your past. So that you can say to yourself that just because drugs have been a part of my family history doesn't mean that it has to be a part of my reality or my future destiny. That just because alcohol has been one of the things that has defined my family, alcohol won't define me. That just because favoritism with children or mismanagement in relationships is something that has been a part of my yesterday doesn't mean that it has to be a part of my today. What happens when you are placed into the family of God, and when you understand who God is and who you are in God, now you have the ability to shatter some of those mindsets. And one of the biggest things that every believer needs to do is we got to understand that freedom is not just a physical enterprise. It's not just something that happens to me physically. That the freedom of God is holistic, it's comprehensive in nature. So when God frees me, it's about my mind, it's about my soul, which soul contains my emotions and my will and all of that. Freedom is all inclusive, so that now my decisions and now my behaviors, my attitudes are all different. And because they are different, that impacts my character. Who I am is different. And because now my character is different, now ultimately my destiny, the course of which I'm moving forward, is now changed. What you do is you're taking power back. And yesterday doesn't have the power anymore to define me. But this new reality, this new family, this new name defines me, and it sets the course for my destiny. One of the things I love about adoption, as Paul was talking about it, is that adoption meant that if I had a debt, once I got with the new family, that debt was canceled. And God does that when he pulls us into the new family. He cancels the debt of our past so that no longer defines us. But the family that we are in, this new name, brings about a new opportunity. All right, so I'm done. I need to pick this up next week. Plan to join me next week again. We're gonna get heavy into this family stuff. I didn't mean to get this heavy on a Sunday morning, but I think it's just important that we talk about how family impacts our emotional health and how that ultimately impacts who we are. All right. So let me just close in prayer, but let me invite you, those of you who want to worship with us, make sure that you connect with us at 12 o'clock. We're going to worship God at 12. While I'm thinking about that 12 o'clock worship experience, let me also let you know that on July 5th, we are going to worship outside. And so those of you who are in Erie, I want you to already plan to meet me so that we can worship outside. Bring your, come in your cars. You want to bring your lawn chairs, you can bring your lawn chairs. But we are going to do another worship experience outside so that we can see each other and we could be in the fellowship. Let's pray. Father, I love you. I thank you and I praise you for this time, this opportunity to discuss family. There's some things in our past that has been ongoing, and we need to deal with it. It's crossed generation, and we need to deal with it. So give us what we need to do that. Expose areas that we need to shine some light on, so that whatever happened yesterday doesn't have to define us today. I'm so grateful for this opportunity just to be with our brothers and our sisters in this digital form. Now bless us as we make preparation for worship at 12. Pray that you would already create an atmosphere of praise and worship as we seek to honor you. It's in Jesus' name that I thank you and give you praise. Amen and amen. All right, everybody. We are out, and I will see many of you at 12 o'clock as we worship during our noonday worship experience. Thank you for joining us. So sorry I was late getting on today, but I think we have all of our connection issues rectified, and I'll be looking forward to worshiping with you at 12 o'clock. All right, we'll talk real soon. Bye-bye now.